A morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, casting geometric shadows across the marble floor. Victoria Sterling stood in her walk-in closet, a space larger than most people's bedrooms, running her fingers along the row of designer dresses. Each garment represented a small fortune, yet none of them brought her the satisfaction she'd once imagined wealth would provide. She selected a cream Chanel suit, the kind that whispered rather than shouted money, and laid it carefully on the velvet bench. Downstairs, she could hear Marcus moving through the kitchen, probably grabbing his usual espresso before heading to the office. Their morning routine had become a carefully choreographed dance of avoidance, two people sharing an enormous space, yet occupying completely separate worlds. She remembered when they used to bump into each other in their tiny studio apartment, laughing as they navigated around one another, stealing kisses while waiting for the coffee to brew. That was 15 years ago, before Marcus's tech startup exploded into a billion-dollar empire, before the money had changed everything. Victoria descended the spiral staircase, her heels clicking against the imported Italian marble. Marcus stood by the kitchen island, scrolling through his phone, his Tom Ford suit perfectly pressed. He barely glanced up as she entered. "I'll be late tonight," he said, his voice flat and businesslike. "Investors' dinner in Manhattan." "Another one?" Victoria poured herself coffee from the machine that cost more than a used car. "That's the third time this week." "Building an empire requires sacrifice, Vic. You of all people should understand that." He finally looked at her, but his eyes were distant, as if he were looking through her rather than at her. "You wanted this life, the houses, the cars, the lifestyle. This is what it takes." She wanted to argue, to tell him that she'd never asked for the cold distance that had grown between them, that she'd trade every diamond in her collection for one genuine smile from him. But she'd learned that such conversations only led to his lecture about gratitude, about how lucky she was, about how millions of women would kill to be in her position. So instead, she simply nodded and took a sip of her coffee. Marcus grabbed his briefcase and headed toward the door. "Oh, and the decorator is coming today about the Hamptons house. Make sure she understands we want it done before Memorial Day. Spare no expense." He paused at the doorway, and for a moment Victoria thought he might say something more, something real. But he simply adjusted his watch and left, the door closing with a soft, final click. Alone in the cavernous kitchen, Victoria looked around at the gleaming surfaces, the top-of-the-line appliances, the fresh flowers that were delivered daily. Everything was perfect, meticulously curated, and utterly soulless. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts, looking for someone to call, someone to talk to. But as she scanned the names, she realized that most of them were acquaintances from her current life, people who knew her as Marcus Sterling's wife, who wanted to be seen with her at charity galas and gallery openings, but who didn't really know her at all. Her thumb hovered over her sister Emma's name, Emma, who still lived in their hometown in Ohio, who taught elementary school and lived in a modest 3-bedroom house with her husband and 2 kids. They hadn't spoken in months, not since the awkward Christmas gathering where Emma's husband made a joke about private jets, and Victoria saw the way Emma looked at her, a mixture of pity and something else she couldn't name. The doorbell rang, pulling her from her thoughts. Through the security camera feed on the kitchen screen, she saw the decorator, a woman named Isabel, whom she'd worked with before. Victoria pressed the intercom button. "Come up, Isabel." As she waited for the elevator to bring her to the penthouse level, Victoria caught her reflection in the polished chrome of the refrigerator. At 42, she looked younger than her years, thanks to an excellent dermatologist and a personal trainer who came 5 days a week. Her honey blonde hair was perfectly highlighted, her skin glowing. She looked like success incarnate. So why did she feel so empty? Isabel swept in with her usual energy, carrying fabric swatches and mood boards. They spent the next 2 hours discussing paint colors and furniture placement for a house Marcus and Victoria would probably spend 2 weeks in all year. Isabel showed her samples of silk wallpaper that cost hundreds of dollars per square foot, and Victoria approved them without hesitation. Money, after all, was no object. It never was anymore. After Isabel left, Victoria found herself wandering through the penthouse, room after room of exquisite taste and crushing loneliness. In Marcus's study, she noticed his laptop was still open on the desk. He must have forgotten it in his rush this morning. She knew his password. They'd set up the same one years ago, back when they still shared everything. Her finger hovered over the touchpad, then pulled back. She'd never snooped before. They'd always had trust. But something made her look again. Maybe it was the distance in his eyes that morning, or the too frequent late nights, or the way he'd stopped touching her, even casually, months ago. She moved the mouse, and the screen came to life.
His email was open. The most recent message was from someone named Adriana. Victoria's heart began to pound as she clicked on it. "Last night was incredible. I can't stop thinking about you. Same hotel Thursday? I'll wear that dress you like." Victoria's hands trembled as she scrolled through the thread. Months of messages, intimate details, plans and promises. The room seemed to spin around her. She gripped the edge of the desk, her knuckles white. With shaking hands, she opened more emails, found more evidence. There wasn't just Adriana. There was a woman named Sophia from 6 months ago, and before her, someone called Michelle. Her husband, it seemed, had been systematically unfaithful for over a year, possibly longer. Victoria walked to the window, looking out over the Manhattan skyline. From this height, the people below looked like ants, scurrying about their insignificant lives. She'd thought she was above all that, protected by wealth and status. But pain, she was learning, was democratic. It didn't care how much money you had. She could leave him. She had a good lawyer, came from family money herself, though nothing compared to Marcus's fortune. She'd be fine financially, but the thought of going through a divorce, of becoming tabloid fodder, of proving to Emma and everyone else from her old life that they'd been right to worry, filled her with a deep shame. More than that, she realized with a sick feeling, she wasn't sure who she was anymore without Marcus and his money. She'd given up her career in architecture when his company took off. He'd convinced her it made more sense for her to manage their increasingly complex personal life. "You're so good at it," he'd said, "and we don't need the money." At first, it had felt like a luxury. No more late nights at the firm, no more demanding clients. She could pursue her interests, volunteer, travel. But somehow those interests had never materialized. Instead, she'd become a professional wife, and now she didn't know how to be anything else. Victoria spent the rest of the day in a daze. She went through the motions, confirming appointments with the housekeeper, responding to emails about a charity auction she was helping organize, ordering groceries through an app. Everything continued as normal, even though her world had fundamentally shifted. That evening, when Marcus came home, much earlier than expected, she was sitting in the living room with a glass of wine. He looked surprised to see her. "No dinner plans?" he asked, loosening his tie. "I was waiting for you," she said, carefully. "We need to talk." Something in her tone made him pause. He set down his briefcase and studied her face. "What's wrong?" "You left your laptop open this morning," she said, watching his expression change from confusion to understanding to something harder. "Victoria." "How long, Marcus? How long have you been making a fool of me?" I sighed and poured himself a drink from the bar cart. "It's not what you think." "Please don't insult me by lying," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "I saw the emails, multiple women, months of planning secret meetings while I sit here playing house in our perfect prison." Marcus took a long drink. When he spoke, his voice was cold. "You want to know the truth? Fine. Yes, I've been seeing other women.
You want to know why? Because you stopped being a real person years ago. You became this perfect mannequin. All you care about is which charity gala to attend, which designer is showing next season, what the other wives think of you. When was the last time we had a real conversation? When was the last time you had an original thought? The words hit her like physical blows. That's not fair. You're the one who wanted this life. You're the one who pushed me to quit my job, to focus on managing our lifestyle. I became what you wanted me to be. I wanted a partner, not a dependent, he shot back. I wanted someone who understood the pressure I'm under, who could match my ambition. Instead, I got someone who spends my money and complains about being lonely. Your money? Victoria stood up, her wine sloshing dangerously in the glass. Your money? I gave up everything for you, my career, my friends, my family. I moved across the country, isolated myself, all so you could build your empire without distractions. And now you're punishing me for it? Nobody forced you to do anything, Marcus said. You made your choices, and let's be honest, you haven't exactly suffered. Look around you. Do you have any idea how privileged you are? Privileged? She laughed bitterly. Yes, I'm so privileged to be cheated on in a penthouse instead of a studio apartment. The marble floors really soften the blow of your betrayal. They stared at each other across the expensive furniture, two strangers who'd once believed they'd spend their lives together. The silence stretched between them, heavy with years of unspoken resentments and gradual disconnection. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice quieter. Maybe we should consider whether this marriage still makes sense. Are you asking for a divorce? Victoria's heart pounded. I'm saying maybe it's time for both of us to admit this isn't working. We could do it quietly, civilly. You'd be well taken care of, financially, of course. Of course. Money. The answer to everything. The answer to every problem. Victoria felt something inside her crack, a dam that had been holding back years of suppressed feelings. I don't want your money, Marcus. I want my life back. I want to remember who I was before I became Mrs. Sterling, professional trophy wife. I want to feel something real again. Then maybe you should figure out who that person is, because I haven't seen her in a long time. He walked out of the room, and Victoria heard his footsteps heading towards one of the guest suites. They wouldn't even share a bedroom tonight. Victoria sat back down, her legs suddenly weak, and looked around the living room. Everything in it cost a fortune. The abstract painting on the wall had been purchased at auction for $200,000. The rug beneath her feet was hand-woven in Iran and had taken 3 years to complete. The sofa she sat on was custom-made Italian leather. None of it mattered. None of it meant anything. Victoria pulled out her phone and, before she could second-guess herself, called Emma. Her sister answered on the third ring, sounding surprised. "Vic, is everything okay?" At the sound of her sister's voice, something in Victoria broke. The tears she'd been holding back all day finally came, and through them she managed to say, "No, nothing is okay. Can we talk?" "Of course," Emma said, her voice immediately shifting to concern. "Tell me everything." And Victoria did. She told her sister about the emails, about Marcus's coldness, about how lost she felt. Emma listened without judgment, occasionally making sympathetic sounds. When Victoria finally ran out of words, Emma was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "I don't know," Victoria admitted. "That's the problem. I don't know who I am anymore. I don't know what I want. All I know is that I can't keep living like this." Then maybe that's where you start. Maybe you start by remembering who you were before all this. Do you remember? You used to sketch buildings on every napkin you could find. You loved hiking and photography. You volunteered at the animal shelter. You laughed all the time. When did you stop doing those things? Victoria thought back. It had been gradual, she realized. As Marcus's company grew, so did the demands on her time and appearance. There were always social obligations, always people to impress, always the need to present a perfect image. Her hobbies seemed frivolous, embarrassing even, in the face of such wealth and responsibility. She'd let them slip away, one by one, until she couldn't remember the last time she'd done something just for herself, just because it brought her joy. "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't know when I lost myself." "It's not too late to find her again," Emma said. "But Vic, you need to be honest with yourself. What do you want? Not what Marcus wants, not what society expects, not what looks good from the outside. What do you actually want?" After they hung up, Victoria sat in the dark living room for a long time, thinking about her sister's question. The city lights twinkled below, and somewhere in the penthouse, Marcus was probably already asleep, or perhaps on the phone with one of his mistresses. It didn't matter. What mattered was that Victoria had a choice to make. She could file for divorce, take her settlement, and try to rebuild a life. Or she could stay, accept that this is what marriage looked like at this level, that perhaps love was a luxury that wealthy people couldn't afford. Plenty of women in her social circle had made that calculation. She'd heard the whispered conversations at luncheons, the knowing looks exchanged when someone's husband was spotted with a younger woman. It was simply how things were done.
But the thought of accepting that, of becoming one of those women who looked the other way and focused on their jewelry collections and vacation homes, made Victoria feel physically ill. She'd rather be broke and alone than wealthy and dead inside. The next morning, Victoria made a decision. She called her old college roommate, Diane, who was now a successful architect with her own firm in Chicago. They'd lost touch over the years, but Diane had reached out a few times. Invitations Victoria had always declined because she'd been too busy or because Marcus had something else planned. "Victoria Sterling," Diane said when she answered, surprise evident in her voice. "Wow, it's been, 5 years?" "6. Victoria said. "I know I've been a terrible friend, but I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Do you have any openings at your firm? Even entry level? I need to work again." There was a pause. "Are you serious? I thought you were living the high life in Manhattan." "I was, but that life is killing me. I need to remember how to be a person again, not just someone's wife. I know I'm rusty, and I know I'd probably need to start over in a lot of ways, but I'm willing to work. I need to work." Diane was quiet for a moment, then said, "Actually, I could use someone with your background. We've been growing, and I've been looking for someone to help manage some of our residential projects. It wouldn't be what you're probably used to in terms of salary." "I don't care about the salary," Victoria interrupted. "I just need to do something real again." They talked for another hour, and by the end of the conversation, Victoria had the outline of a plan. She would stay in New York for now, but she'd start working remotely for Diane's firm while she figured out the divorce proceedings. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Marcus barely noticed her new schedule. She told him she'd taken on some consulting work, and he'd simply nodded and returned to his phone. She realized that he probably preferred her distracted and occupied. It meant fewer uncomfortable conversations about the state of their marriage. For the first time in years, Victoria began to feel something other than numbness. The work was challenging, forcing her to use parts of her brain that had atrophied from disuse. She collaborated with Diane's team via video calls, rediscovered her love of design and problem-solving. Some nights, she found herself so absorbed in a project that she forgot what time Marcus came home. One evening, about 3 weeks into her new routine, she was sketching in the home office when Marcus appeared in the doorway. He looked at her with something like surprise. "You're working," he said, as if this were a novel concept. "Yes," she replied, not looking up from her drawing. "On what?" "A residential project in Chicago. Diane Chen's firm hired me as a consultant." "Diane Chen? Your college roommate?" "Yes." "Why do you need to work? If you're bored, we could plan another trip. The Maldives, maybe, or—" "I don't want another trip, Marcus," she said, finally meeting his eyes. "I want a purpose. I want to do something that matters." He looked genuinely confused.
But you do things that matter. The charity work, the planning parties and writing checks isn't enough anymore. It never was, really. I just convinced myself it was because it was easier than admitting I'd given up everything that made me who I am. Marcus was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful. Is this about the affairs? Victoria laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. The affairs are a symptom, not the disease. We've been dying for years, Marcus. We just had enough money to make dying comfortable. What do you want, Victoria? Do you want me to apologize? Fine, I'm sorry. Do you want me to end things with them? Consider it done. Do you want couples therapy? I'll make time for it. Just tell me what you want and I'll make it happen. It was, she realized, the most emotion she'd heard from him in months, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't real. I want a divorce, she said quietly. The words hung in the air between them. Marcus's face went through a series of expressions: shock, anger, calculation, and finally, resignation. If that's what you want, he said finally. It is. We'll need to work out the details. I'll have my lawyer contact yours. I'll be fair, Victoria. You know I will. I know, she said, and she did know. Marcus would be generous with the money. He'd always believed that money could solve everything, could smooth over any hurt, could make up for any failing. She'd believed it too, once. After he left, Victoria would turn to her sketches, but her hands were shaking. She'd done it. She'd said the words that would change everything. Tomorrow she'd call a lawyer. She'd start the process of disentangling her life from Marcus's. It would be messy and painful and probably very public, but it would be real. The following weeks passed in a blur of legal consultations and practical arrangements. Victoria moved into one of their other properties, a much smaller apartment in Brooklyn that they'd purchased as an investment years ago. It had 3 rooms and old hardwood floors that creaked. She loved it immediately. Marcus was true to his word about being fair. He offered her a settlement that would keep her comfortable for life, but Victoria surprised him, and perhaps herself, by asking for less than half of what he proposed. She wanted enough to be secure, enough to not worry about basic needs, but she didn't want to be so wealthy that she fell back into the same trap of believing money could substitute for meaning. "Are you sure?" her lawyer asked, looking at her like she'd lost her mind. "You're entitled to much more." "I'm sure," Victoria said. "I don't want his money. I never really did." The divorce was finalized on a cold day in November. Victoria stood on the steps of the courthouse, breathing in the sharp air, feeling lighter than she had in years. She pulled out her phone and called Emma. "It's done," she said. "How do you feel?" Emma asked. She thought about it. "Poor," she said, and then she laughed. "I feel poor and scared and completely uncertain about the future. And Emma, I feel free." 6 months later, Victoria stood in her small office at Diane's firm in Chicago. She'd moved there after the divorce was final, leaving New York and all its associations behind. Her apartment was modest, a 1-bedroom in a neighborhood that was still up and coming. She'd sold most of the jewelry Marcus had given her over the years, keeping only a few pieces that had genuine sentimental value. The work was demanding, and the pay was good, but not extravagant. She had to budget, something she hadn't done in over a decade. She took the train instead of calling a car service. She cooked her own meals more often than she ate out. And she was happier than she'd been in years. Her current project was a community center for a working-class neighborhood. The budget was tight, which meant she had to be creative with her designs, had to prioritize function over flash. It was the opposite of everything she'd been doing for the past decade, and she loved every challenging minute of it. "Victoria?" Diane poked her head into the office. "There's someone here to see you." Victoria looked up, surprised. She wasn't expecting anyone. She walked out to the reception area and stopped short. Marcus stood there, looking out of place in his expensive suit amidst the casual atmosphere of the architecture firm. He looked older, she thought, or perhaps more tired. "Marcus," she said, "what are you doing here?" "He was in Chicago for business. I thought I'd stop by. Is there somewhere we could talk?" They walked to a coffee shop down the street. It was a far cry from the upscale restaurants they used to frequent, with mismatched furniture and local art on the walls. Marcus looked around with barely concealed distaste. "How have you been?" he asked after they'd ordered. "Good," Victoria said, and was surprised to realize she meant it. Really good, actually. "You saw the article about your community center project. In the Tribune, they mentioned you used to be married to me. Is that why you're here? Worried about your image?" "No," he said, and he actually looked hurt. "I'm here because reading that article, seeing you passionate about something, made me realize something. I never really knew you, did I? I thought I did. I thought I knew what you wanted, what would make you happy, but I was projecting. I assumed you wanted what I wanted." We were both guilty of that, I think. We stopped being real people to each other. We became roles we were playing. "I've been in therapy," Marcus said abruptly, "since the divorce. My therapist says I use money as a shield, that I learned early that wealth could protect me from vulnerability. She says I never learned how to have a real relationship because I never learned how to be vulnerable." "That sounds accurate," Victoria said, not unkindly. "I'm sorry," he said, and his eyes met hers for the first time since he'd arrived. "I'm genuinely sorry for how I treated you. For the affairs, yes, but more than that, I'm sorry for making you feel like you had to be someone you weren't. I'm sorry for not seeing you, really seeing you, for so many years." Victoria felt something loosen in her chest, a knot she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. "Thank you," she said. "That means something." They talked for another hour, really talked, in a way they never had during their marriage. Marcus told her about his therapy, about how he was trying to understand himself better, to build real connections. Victoria told him about her work, about the satisfaction she got from creating something meaningful, something that would actually help people. As they parted ways outside the coffee shop, Marcus paused. "You were right, about the money. I thought it could solve everything, buy anything. Turns out there are some things it can't buy." "Like what?" Victoria asked. "Like knowing who you really are, like genuine connection, like the kind of peace you seem to have found." Victoria watched him walk away, a figure in an expensive suit disappearing into the Chicago afternoon. She felt a wave of compassion for him, mixed with gratitude. Their marriage had been a painful lesson, but it had taught her something crucial, that